I started working in policy at a relatively young age, and for accidental reasons, I took a role in the actual writing of policy. And I became aware that we needed more information about how people think about these things and the impact of the kind of policy that we were writing. So I decided to follow an MA degree in order to acquire these skills. So then I went into the master's degree to try to understand how can you look at the impact of policy, how can you obtain information on people before you carry out the policy outcomes. And I fell in love with academia. I saw that the potential was far beyond just my smaller ambitions, that you could develop deeper understandings of people's relationships with the environment that could really be of great consequence. So once I started my master's degree, I fell in love with the idea of understanding better the complexity of human relationships with the environment or with non-humans, so whether it's animals or plants or what have you. There are different disciplines that offer different kinds of insights into these issues. Anthropology is a very global discipline, so you can look at a variety of dimensions of people's understandings and practices in relation to the environment. From economics to social arrangements to the way in which they think about these things. So from then, I decided to specialize in human relations with animals. I first looked at how humans understand practices of the development of whale watching businesses as a source of economic livelihood, but also as a cultural path of continuity with their whaling legacies. In this context, I looked at the kinds of knowledge that different groups bring onto the table to understand these topics, and how the different types of knowledge contribute to an understanding of human relationships with these animals and the various impacts that they can have. This was interesting research, but later for my doctoral research, and beyond my doctoral research, I became interested in a wider scope of intervention. So the question became, how can you get regular people, regular citizens, regular consumers to engage in environmental practices that are good for conservation? People often think of conservation as something that happens in the Amazon or some pristine nature in the global south, but common daily practices of gardening, for example, can have a huge environmental impact. So if you could get people to do the kinds of gardening that contribute with biodiversity services and so on, this would be of great benefit. So from that, I went on to study botanic gardens. There are about 3,000 botanic gardens around the world, and the number is growing every day. And one of the things they do is teach citizens, people who live in urban spaces even, how to do gardening practices that don't just serve aesthetic purposes, but also contribute to creating habitat for pollinators, for invertebrate and all sorts of creatures that are important, ecological pathways for birds to fly from spot to spot, or creatures like butterflies. And so my research became concentrated on looking at this. Also how you can mix the production of gardening for aesthetic purposes with gardening for food purposes. The role of food is really important. When you're talking about botanic gardens trying to educate urban citizens in the production of food, it's not just about producing nutrients that people will end up eating. It serves a whole slew of other purposes. So a lot of people living in urban spaces have no idea of what is the ecological cost of producing food. So how much time goes into producing a vegetable that you're going to eat, how much energy, how much effort. So by teaching people to grow their own food, you're developing a greater awareness of the ecological dynamics that are behind food production. So that tends to lead to, hopefully, a greater respect for food and how it's produced, greater awareness of the environmental dynamics that go into food production. So if you want to produce vegetables, you need to have flowers for pollinators to come. You need to have habitat for these pollinators to thrive, so that you can produce food. And people start to become aware that there are all sorts of connections in the production of food between the habitat, the soil, the pollinators, the plants that you select, which hopefully mitigates this sense of estrangement that a lot of urban people have in relation to food, how it's produced, and what its real costs are. This also speaks to broader issues for some botanic gardens like Edinburgh, for example, or Bristol, of how to educate perhaps communities that are in what we might call food deserts. So if you think of a city on a very large scale, there are communities that are not, for example, close to a supermarket, neighborhoods that are far from supermarkets. And these people, if they're also impoverished, oftentimes then, because they don't have access to supermarkets, they can't drive to one, or there are no public transportation solutions, they don't eat very healthy diets. So by teaching them to grow their own food, again, you nourish this ability for people to overcome some of these limitations and to overcome some of the negative aspects of poverty. The idea is not necessarily to develop self-sufficiency. That would be ideal, but it's not always possible. The idea is to teach people what is nutrient-rich food as opposed to foods that are high in calorie but not very rich in nutrients and so on. So it's a more of a holistic approach to food as something that is embedded in social relations but also can mitigate issues of poverty, issues of education, class background, and how people go about eating. On the other hand, the production of plants has also been used to deal with other issues, for example, social isolation, integration. So for example, there's a Bristol project and there's another one in Birmingham where they've developed community gardens so that newcomers in those societies can actually participate collectively in growing plants with people who already live there, and in that way begin to develop social relationships amongst each other so that they can then be better integrated in the community. Another project that's really interesting, or another application of these sort of relationships, have to do with therapeutic interventions. So if you think of somebody who's had a stroke, for example, or who has lived with depression for a very long time, people have used techniques of growing plants as a form of therapy. In the case of strokes, if you are growing plants in what we would call raised beds, so that a person can reach the plants without having to bend over it with mobility issues, you can get them to do movements with their arms while they're growing, so which is a form of getting people who have had a stroke and maybe have a mobility impairment to engage with the physical activity without the more constrictive pressure of doing physical therapy, where there's a pressure on performance. So with the plants you're relaxing, and if you don't get it quite right, the pressure isn't quite there because you're kind of relaxing growing the plant. And this is a way of getting people to do some exercise as well. And there are therapy interventions that are developed in this way. Also to get people to maybe feel that they're doing a useful contribution to the environment or food production. In the case of depression, I've seen this being used, people producing food collectively, and one of the issues with depression sometimes is social isolation. It's on the one hand a result of depression, but on the other hand, people who are depressed tend to become socially isolated. So by collectively having a context to grow foods, this issue of isolation tends to be mitigated as people get more and more involved collectively in a common project of gardening. The social sciences contributed to wider debates in multiple ways, and I'm sure that your interviews are going to show various aspects of this. In the context of this research on botanic gardens, I think one of the ways in which we can contribute is to give regular people, so people who are not experts, they're citizens, living in cities, for example, and who would like to follow the kinds of behaviors that contribute to greater biodiversity or the provision of ecological services, but they're not quite sure how this can be done. And oftentimes people think that, you know, something like biodiversity conservation is something that experts do in conservation areas that are far away, and that all they can do is to write a check to an NGO, for example. But if you start to show all these different projects that are aimed at regular citizens, you know, children who are doing gardening and learning that veggies taste nice, and that they're nutritious and that there's fun in growing them. Other projects where citizens are invited to create habitat corridors. Because, for example, if you have a migratory species like the monarch butterfly, which is extremely popular, unless they have places where they can stop regularly, you know, lay their eggs and continue moving, then this migration is impaired. So people can actually plant things that will contribute to the creation of corridors of habitat, even for birds and things like that. So I think it empowers people so that they understand that they have a role that they can play that is of great importance in this context of addressing big environmental issues in small ways that on the aggregate level end up making a very big difference. And so one of the ways in which we ought to contribute is by creating the kinds of output that people can actually engage with. So we write oftentimes very good analytical articles, as you know, that tackle the complexity of these issues, but then when you share them outside an academic context, there's an issue of translation. We don't write in ways that are very appealing. So I think more and more now we make a big effort to try to create materials that are accessible, like these interviews that you are making, like multimedia kinds of engagement, maybe ebooks where people can see what other people are doing around the world, but also in taking know-how to the new places that we go. So if you're doing research in a botanic garden and you learn about a way in which they got a community to engage in a conservation project, like Bristol Zoo Gardens has a wonderful project where they got regular citizens spread throughout the city to actually participate in the production of a national plant collection. So individuals in communities and groups will actually grow plants for this national seed collection. And you can take that somewhere else and show in other places how this has been done, and then maybe that will provide people with food for thought to develop programs that are adapted to their own context. So this idea of showing examples that have worked and disseminating this knowledge more widely. Another aspect that sometimes it's so obvious to us that we end up forgetting it when we're talking about it in a formal context, but a lot of us in academia teach students who are not going to become scholars necessarily. I teach every year hundreds of undergrads in their first, second year of studies, and these will become citizens. So if you can show some of this knowledge in your class and show them that there are ways in which as citizens they can follow practices that will be better for the environment, then you're creating educated citizens who can go out there and maybe teach their own kids, their spouses, and so on.